Short answer: a triangular region in the Pacific drawn from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the southwest to Easter Island in the east, encompassing the vast oceanic region settled by the Polynesian peoples. This is the second part of my two-parter about the Austronesian expansion, as the settlement of Polynesia was the second and much later part of the spread of Austronesian-speaking people. Earlier it was believed that the Polynesians spread out from Micronesia due to the Polynesians lacking the mixing with the aboriginal peoples seen in Melanesia. Today this has changed to a theory of Polynesia being settled from Melanesia via Fiji to Samoa and Tonga and onwards. The lack of aboriginal mixing is now perceived as being the result of limited contact before the Polynesians spread out across the Pacific with the remainers in Melanesia mixing. This is reasonable as the Austronesians were much more coastal peoples than the aboriginals, meaning that mixing would take time. Melanesia also has the best connection out to the islands of Polynesia as compared to the low density of islands in Micronesia. Thus, the common theory is that the outliers of the first Austronesian expansion reached the Polynesian islands of Samoa and Tonga around 800 BC, and then a long hiatus set in. Samoa and Tonga are the easternmost part of the Austronesian Lapita culture, defined by their ceramic works. Ceramics were abandoned in Polynesia due to the lack of clay on the islands, but findings in Samoa and Tonga of Lapita ceramics also point to a Melanesian connection. During the long hiatus in new settlements after 800 BC, the peoples of Samoa and Tonga disconnected from the nearby Melanesian Fiji, developing a uniquely Polynesian culture. It was this new culture that would spread out across the vastness of the Pacific Center. It is not quite known when this second expansion began, with estimates between 1000 and 1500 years after 800 BC. However, by between 1000 AD and 1150 AD, the central region of the Polynesian Triangle had been settled. That is the Cook Islands, Society Islands, and Marquesas Islands. From this central region, the outliers at the corners of the Polynesian Triangle, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, would be reached between 1200 and 1300 AD. With the settlement of New Zealand, the Polynesians would even adapt their culture to a temperate climate, becoming the Maori. Hawaii and especially New Zealand would also by far be the largest landmasses settled by the Polynesians. It is worth noting that the isolation of the early Polynesians on Samoa and Tonga meant that later Austronesian naval designs like double outrigger canoes and trimarans never reached them. Thus the spread across the Pacific happened with catamarans and single outrigger canoes carrying crab-claw sails. They did have reversible outrigger canoes, but when shunting this is not that important. Please see my Austronesian expansion video for more on shunting. The Polynesians also developed crab-claw sails with masts, primarily in Hawaii like the ones on the voyaging canoe Hokulea in the 1970s. With these tools, the Polynesians managed to settle the Pacific all the way to Easter Island. The distance did mean that some areas would develop in relative isolation, like New Zealand and Easter Island. Other areas where the islands were small and lacked resources to fully sustain the population developed island hopping, where people either migrated back and forth between islands that in tandem could sustain them, or from island to island, giving them a rest period between settlement. On Easter Island, where island hopping was not feasible due to distance, the island would be depleted, ending the rich culture that spawned the Moai statues. To traverse the huge distances across the Pacific, the Polynesian navigators developed a fine-tuned oral tradition that, along with experience, allowed them to navigate between the islands. They would use navigation by stars as recorded in oral tradition and follow migrating land birds. Another unique navigational method was by the swelling of the ocean surface. Swelling are distinct wave patterns formed on the surface when currents hit land or near surface obstacles. By following the swelling made by islands, the navigators could track down islands over great distances. As they sailed between the islands, the Polynesians also spread their crops from island to island. Thus, the coconut palm was spread to both supply nuts and wood for the canoes and catamarans. The Polynesians never brought along the Austronesian rice paddy culture, as the islands did not have the conditions for this. The sweet potato was grown across Polynesia, however, pointing to an American connection, as the plant is native to South America. Thor Heyerdahl proved with his Kentucky expedition that ancient Peruvians could have reached Polynesia by raft. The Polynesians, with their navigational skills, might just as likely have gone the other way. As Heyerdahl showed, one could go with the winds and currents along the upper part of the South Pacific Oceanic Gyre, but it would also be possible to take the equatorial countercurrent the other way. Thus, it might be possible to sail back and forth across the Pacific using only these two currents and a rudder to slowly turn between them, thus staying in a current-driven circular path. The Polynesians would possibly have been able to reach America without using only currents, but it is easier to ride along on the currents, especially if you can do it both ways. And the Polynesians were quite capable of reaching Easter Island, New Zealand and Hawaii, so the Americas would not be impossible, but they do not seem to have settled there, maybe due to it already being inhabited or not having the right conditions, perhaps due to the cooling effect of the Humboldt Current. So the Polynesians stayed within their triangle, creating the most heavily maritime culture in history. This culture was heavily affected by the arrival of Europeans during the Age of Sail. European naval technology replaced much of the traditional boat building on longer voyages, and much navigational knowledge was lost. The Polynesians became much more bound to the islands, with supplies coming from larger ships. Even to this day, schooners deliver to the more isolated islands where larger cargo ships are not cost-effective. The age of island hopping ended with borders being carved across the waves. However, in recent decades, more and more of the island groups of Polynesia and their cousins in Micronesia and Melanesia have gained independence, or at least a higher degree of internal autonomy. This has created some of the world's nations with the least landmass, but with very large exclusive economic zones, giving the many islands with vast oceanic regions around them. Here arises a legal conundrum as to what happens to these exclusive economic zones if the low-lying islands at their center become submerged by rising sea level, not to mention the people who will no longer have their land. It is in the interest of these island nations to do what they can to retain their homes as best they can, and also the exclusive economic zones. A solution could be to adapt to the sea, as in the past, by building houses on stilts that can be elongated, or standing on rafts anchored to stone or concrete blocks, so that if the island is flooded, the buildings and the towns would simply lift off with the water surface and remaining in the position of the island through the anchor block. These rafts need not be too complex, as many of these island nations are not that wealthy and rely on aid. They might be built from the native palms, like their historic catamarans. Then a further evolution of this idea of retaining the existing low-lying islands and atolls could be based on the biorock of Wolf Hilbert's, where a limestone base of coral reefs is created and speeded up by mineral accretion technology, that is, using electricity to accrete minerals from seawater. Thus, over time, new reefs could be built up from the submerged island using electricity from solar cells, small windmills, or tidal generators, where narrow atoll openings makes that an option. This would limit the need for imported energy. As pearls are a large export commodity of the island nations of Oceania, and pearl oysters grow in coral reefs, this might be a way of gaining some finance. This has much in common with seasteading concepts, but is not about building new communities at sea, but retaining nations and cultures already there. If you like this idea and concept, please feel free to share, like and subscribe, or in other ways show your support. I hope you like this two-parter about the Austronesians and my own little vision here at the end. I will most likely return to it in the future.